On the very first day I walked through the gates of that convent, before I had even set down my bags, the Mother Superior looked at me with the strangest expression I had ever seen on another person's face. Not curiosity, not a welcome, something closer to recognition. She placed an old wooden box into my hands, dark, smooth, carved with symbols I didn't understand, and she said, in the quietest voice I had ever heard, "No one was ever allowed to open this until you arrived." And I remember standing there, holding something that felt impossibly heavy for its size, wondering what kind of place I had just walked into. By the end of what I'm about to tell you, you will understand exactly why that box had been waiting for me long before I was ever born, and why the moment I finally opened it changed everything I believed about my own life and where I came from. To understand why that impossible box had my name written all over its destiny, I have to take you back to before any of this happened, back to who I was before I ever set foot in that place. My name is Sister Marguerite. Before I was a nun, I was a quiet woman with an ordinary life, a love for old books, and an almost stubborn belief that every mystery eventually has an honest answer if you're patient enough to look for it. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of parents who were good, private people. We didn't talk much about family history. My mother always changed the subject when I asked about her side of the family, and I never pushed hard enough to find out why. I was the kind of person who spent Saturdays in the archive section of the public library reading about forgotten chapters of American and European history. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't searching for something. I was just genuinely curious about the world and the people who had shaped it long before I arrived. I entered religious life in my early 30s, which most people thought was late. But for me, it felt exactly right. My faith was never loud. It was more like a quiet compass that had been pointing in one direction my whole life, and I finally decided to follow it completely. When I was assigned to a small, ancient convent in rural France, a place most people in my order had never even heard of, I didn't question it. I packed my bags, said goodbye to everything familiar, and flew across the ocean believing I was simply beginning a new chapter. The convent was built into a hillside like it had grown there naturally. Stone walls so old they had turned the color of charcoal, narrow windows framed by decades of ivy, courtyards so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. The library inside was the kind of room that makes people who love books stop breathing for a second floor to ceiling shelves, leather-bound volumes with handwritten spines, and wooden ladders on rolling rails that reached the highest shelves. There were sealed storage rooms I was told nobody had entered in years. Portraits of abbesses going back hundreds of years hung in one long corridor, and I remember walking past them slowly that first evening, thinking how every one of those women had somehow chosen this same place, this same silence, this same life. What I didn't know yet was that every single one of those abbesses had also been the keeper of that wooden box. The elderly sister who showed me around, Sister Clotilde, who had lived in that convent for over 60 years, told me the basic outline while we walked. The box had been passed from one Mother Superior to the next for as long as anyone could remember. Each one received a simple instruction with it, always the same, always passed down in writing. Protect this box and never allow anyone to open it until a specific nun finally arrives. No name was ever given, no description, just a quiet certainty that they would know her when she came, and every generation had obeyed that instruction without fully understanding it, just trusted it, just waited. I want to be honest with you. My first instinct was not wonder. It was skepticism. I thought it was some kind of tradition, maybe something symbolic, maybe a test for new arrivals. I didn't open the box that first night. I set it on the desk in my small room, looked at it for a long time, and went to sleep telling myself there was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation. But then the questions started coming in ways I wasn't expecting. I began asking the older sisters what they remembered about the box. Most knew only fragments. One remembered an elderly abbess who had spent years searching through the archive for records related to it and found only partial entries, names scratched out, pages that had clearly been removed. Another sister mentioned that a strange visitor had come to the convent sometime in the 1940s, a woman traveling alone who had asked to see the box but was turned away. A third told me she had once noticed that one of the carved symbols on the box matched a symbol she had seen in an old regional genealogy document in the library, but she had never followed up on it because she didn't feel it was her place to know. That detail caught me like a hook. I spent 3 days in that library looking through genealogy records, regional histories, and old correspondence until I found what she was talking about. The symbol appeared in the family records of a group of Protestant refugees who had fled religious persecution in the 1600s and eventually settled in the region. Several of them had later converted and entered religious life, and one of them, a woman named Elise Vautrin, had entered this very convent in 1671. I found a partial journal entry by Elise in a deteriorating volume that had been shelved incorrectly for what looked like a century. She wrote about a promise, a desperate life or death promise made by her family before they scattered across Europe and eventually across the Atlantic. Documents proving the family's legal ownership of land and their right to reclaim a portion of a confiscated estate had been hidden to protect them from further persecution. They were placed into a box, and the box was entrusted to the convent to be opened only by a direct female descendant of Elise's bloodline who had also entered religious life, because Elise believed that only someone with that specific combination of faith, trust, and connection to the family would know what to do with what was inside without letting it become something destructive. I sat in that library with my hands shaking and barely breathed for what felt like 10 minutes, because my mother's maiden name was Vautrin. I had never known what that name meant. She had never told me its history. She changed the subject. She was protecting something she didn't even fully understand herself. But somewhere in the quiet inheritance of her silence, she had passed me into a life that led me, with no deliberate planning, to this exact room, in this exact convent, sitting in front of a box that had been waiting not for a prophecy to be fulfilled, but for a family line to finally produce someone in exactly the right position to complete a promise made 350 years ago. I went back to my room. I sat in front of the box for a long time. I thought about every woman who had protected it without ever knowing why. I thought about Elise, who had trusted completely in something she could not guarantee. I thought about my mother and her silence and whether she had ever felt the weight of something she couldn't name. And then, very carefully, I opened it. Inside there were letters, handwritten in faded ink across brittle paper. There were 2 legal documents from the 1600s, carefully preserved in a wax-sealed cloth wrap, outlining the original land claim and the family's legal standing before the persecution began. There was a small map of the region with a location marked an abandoned monastery where additional family records had been hidden and apparently never retrieved. And at the very bottom, wrapped separately, was a letter written by Elise herself, addressed simply to "My daughter of faith, whenever she arrives." She wrote that she did not know when this letter would be read. She wrote that she was not asking for the land back, that material inheritance was not the point. She was asking whoever came to take the historical records to a place where they could be preserved properly so her family's story could never be erased again. She wrote that she had survived by being hidden and she did not want her descendants to spend their lives hidden too. She wanted someone to stand up and say, clearly and permanently, that her family had existed, had mattered, and had survived. I brought the documents to a historical preservation organization in the region. I worked with them for months. The abandoned monastery was located. The records were retrieved. Elise's family history was formally documented and archived in a regional historical collection that is now accessible to anyone who wants to find it. The convent kept a permanent acknowledgement of its role as guardian. And I wrote to my mother and told her everything. She called me and cried for 20 minutes without saying a single word. After everything settled, I spent a long time sitting in that courtyard thinking about what had actually happened. Nothing magical had occurred, nothing supernatural. A woman 3 centuries ago had made a human decision rooted in love, faith, and the desperate hope that someone, someday, would care enough to finish what she had started. And through a combination of family history, personal choices, and circumstances no one had engineered on purpose, that someone had turned out to be me. I think about Elise often now. I think about all the women who carried that box from one pair of hands to the next without ever knowing why, trusting something they couldn't see the end of. And I think the most powerful kind of inheritance is not land or money or anything you can hold. It's an unfinished story that someone loved enough to protect until the right person was finally ready to complete it. Some promises take generations, some truths wait longer than any single lifetime. And sometimes the quietest, most ordinary life is exactly the one that was needed all along. I want to ask you something before you go. If someone handed you that box on your very first day somewhere new, would you have opened it immediately or would you have spent time uncovering its history first? Tell me honestly in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story completely changed what you were expecting by the end, if that final revelation hit you differently than you thought it would, please share it with someone who loves a mystery that turns out to be about something far more meaningful than treasure. Because some stories deserve to be passed on, just like the box was.